Welcome to Pasa, HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic-serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness. Saludos, HSI familia, and welcome to the 7th episode of ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? As I laid out the first season of the podcast, I tried to find balance in the speakers and topics that we discuss, and especially tried to balance researchers with practitioners. Yet found that many of my guests are both researchers and practitioners in HSIs, which makes for a very rich show. I hope you found it to be helpful to learn alongside so many different people working with and for HSIs. In today's episode, I talked to Dr. Jarett Lujan, who serves as the inaugural director for diversity, equity, and inclusion at Texas A&M University Kingsville. Dr. Lujan talks about his experiences as both an undergraduate and graduate student attending different HSIs or emerging HSIs in Texas, and talks about his plan for his current role as the newly appointed inaugural director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at one of Texas's longtime HSIs. In this episode, he provides us with an exclusive look at his dissertation findings, which used a counter-story approach to critically evaluate the Hispanic-serving identity of an emerging HSI through the eyes of Latine students. Dr. Lujan received a Bachelor of Science in Biology with a minor in chemistry and earned a Master of Education in Student Development and Leadership in Higher Education with an Academic Advising Certificate from Angelo State. He was very active at Angelo State, serving as student body president and running track and field. Notably, he was appointed by Governor Abbott, boo, as the first Hispanic Student Regent of Texas Tech University system. Yay. He served in multiple roles on campus, including coordinator for student activities and admissions counselor, before pursuing his PhD in higher education research at Texas Tech University. Lujan was born in El Paso and raised in Marfa and continues to serve Tejanos in his new role. Prior to the show, I had never met Dr. Lujan, but he came highly recommended as a guest, and now I know why. He is truly a dynamic person and was so much fun to talk to and learn with. I hope you will enjoy this episode of ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? All righty, we are going to go ahead and jump into today's episode of ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? Dr. Lujan, thank you for taking the time to be here today on ¿Qué pasa, HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. But before we talk about what's up with Hispanic-serving institutions, let's talk about you. So this is a podcast for higher education practitioners, researchers, scholars, students. But I always like to start us just with your own journey so that we can know, a little bit about you and how you got into higher ed and through higher ed. So tell us about your higher ed journey, starting with college at Angelo State University and then finally getting a terminal degree at Texas Tech. Tell us about the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you again for inviting me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to share. So my journey is a little bit weird. I'm from a very small town called Marfa, Texas, out in West Texas. A lot of people know it for the Prada store. First generation college student, chose Angelo State ultimately because they allowed me to run track and field. Really wanted to continue my track career. Went there as a biology major, decided to pursue medicine. That was the initial plan. And just like every other higher ed professional, we went into higher ed kind of unconventionally. Didn't know it was a career path, honestly, until I got involved in student government. Really loved being an SGA president. And that's ultimately how I caught the higher ed bug. And I never looked back ever since. And I looked into master's programs at Angelo State, did an online master's program there, while being an admissions counselor, traveling all over the state, trying to recruit people. And then I became a Greek life coordinator and also over the homecoming programs at ASU. So doing a lot of stuff with the Greek community, the fraternity and sorority life. And then I just decided to completely drop all of that, quit my job and go pursue my terminal degree at Texas Tech University. And ultimately how that started was because I became student regent. I was the first Hispanic student regent at the Texas Tech University system. That opened up a lot of different opportunities networking wise for me in my career. I met a lot of great people at Texas Tech, and they decided to influence me to come on to their campus and pursue my PhD there. And so in 2019, I actually went to Texas Tech, got a job as a research assistant, was really interested in HSI research and started diving into that. And that's ultimately what I did my dissertation in. Now that I've completed that, I'm over here at Texas A&M University Kingsville as their inaugural director of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I like to think about people's lives and how the things that they do sort of are reflective in their experiences. And you said you ran track, right? And I feel like your degrees almost were like you were just nonstop running and like picking up degrees along the way. And now ultimately end up in this really powerful position, which is great. But reading your bio, right, and really learning about like that you got involved in student government and being appointed to the governor's board is what an important piece, or this, not the governor's board. What is it?
The Board of Regents.
Board of Regents, that one. I was like, I can't remember what it's called. The Board of Regents. So thank you for sharing that, sort of perspective on like how you got there. But let's rewind you a little bit, little bit. I want to go back because I'd like to talk a little bit about how did you even know how to go to higher ed? How did you even know how to apply? I mean, I know also you spend time helping students to learn. You've been an admissions counselor. So how did you know, right? As a first generation college student, what was your college going process like?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it comes down to I didn't. I going into college, I had a mother who went to college initially, but decided to not pursue that and pursue her family. So a lot of the initial knowledge of getting into college and undergrad was known, but after that, I was completely by myself. She was always there to support. But other than that, I had no intention of going to graduate school. I had no idea what that entailed. I just knew that I was pursuing, medicine, and I didn't even know what that meant, even at that time. I knew you had to go to medical school, didn't know what that commitment was like until later on. And when it came down to it, I had a really great mentor, Dr. Javier Flores. He was the vice president for student affairs and enrollment management at Angelo State. Him and I got really close. I actually worked in his office a couple of times on special projects. And, he really kind of sat me down one day and said, have you ever thought about this career path? And I said, I really never thought it was a career path. I didn't know that education was for me or what higher ed even was. All I thought it was, and this is just something that kills me today as people ask me what higher ed is like, you want to be a professor, right? That's what you want to do. That's what you're doing. And I'm like, not necessarily, but we are educators in every single way. So that's how I got introduced to the topic. Was my mentor. He kind of said, I kind of see this in you. And what's funny is my advisor in biology was actually really good friends with him. And they had a conversation together behind closed doors, and they actually kind of collaborated. So when I met with my biology advisor my senior year, he was like, look, I know you love biology, but I really think that you'd be great. And hearing that from my biology advisor kind of gave me the permission to say, okay, this is something that I can do and that people believe in me to do. And so I'm going to look into it. And that's what I did.
Awesome. Shout out to the good mentors and advisors in our life.
Exactly.
Because we need those, right? We need people to tell us and to help us. And particularly when we're young college students trying to figure out life. And we're like, I don't know, what am I good at? And other people see it, right? And it was clear that other people were seeing, seeing it in you, like, oh, you're going to be good, right? We've got a lot of people had vision for you before you even had vision for yourself.
Absolutely.
In many ways. So, okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about your servingness journey, or another way, otherwise stated, how did HSIs come into your consciousness?
Sure. So initially, when I was in graduate school, so in my master's program, I started kind of learning a little bit about what higher ed was. I knew that I was at an HSI whenever I was at Angelo State. When I actually enrolled there, they had just gotten the designation as an HSI. But I really didn't know what that meant. I just knew that the title was there and that there was a certain amount of Hispanics at this institution. That's all I knew. Getting involved in student government gave me a little bit more of an insight into what that meant for funding wise. And really, whenever I went to become student regent at the system level for the Texas Tech system, that's where I learned a lot about grants and funding across the board, and why these institutions were pursuing the designation to help almost supplement a lot of that funding that wasn't coming in from the state. And so when that happened, I was like, I really took interest in this. So while I was student regent, I took interest in understanding where that money was going. What was that money being used for? And ultimately, what it came down to was I was discovering it wasn't necessarily targeting Hispanic students. That was just me with a higher ed lens, with no research background at all, just kind of realizing that although this was somewhat, geared towards that, it wasn't necessarily impacting, or students really didn't know where that money was going or what it was for. So when it came to pursuing my degree at Texas Tech, my terminal degree, I knew that's what I wanted to study. I really wanted to further understand what this designation meant, but really kind of understand and complicate what it meant to be a Hispanic-serving institution, especially at a predominantly white Hispanic-serving institution, right? We tend to forget that these institutions don't just get rid of their PWI status just because they become an HSI. And so I really wanted to kind of understand what that was. And that's ultimately what led me into truly trying to answer that question, and led me to like your scholarship and other scholars that is trying to answer the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about your dissertation then. So in your dissertation, you used a photo voice methodology and counter narratives to understand how undergraduate Hispanic Latine students perceive the campus environment at a predominantly white HSI, which maybe talk a little bit about that, right? What does that mean to be predominantly white HSI? So tell us a little bit more about that, and then also about what you found, right? Like the practitioners who are listening and the scholars who are listening, like, what did you find?
Yeah, no, I think, starting off with photo voice, I think when I was looking for a method or a way to gather data, I wanted it to be something that kind of wasn't used a lot yet in higher ed research. And one of my professors, Dr. Brian Hotchkins, he had utilized photo voice in one of his studies, looking at a residence hall, specifically Black students in residence halls. And I was really interested in applying that to HSI research. And so when it came to my dissertation, I was like, I think visual examples are needed. What are some visual examples of servingness, and how can we communicate that to both practitioners and to, policymakers as well? And so what I decided to do was use photo voice. And for those that are unfamiliar, it basically allows students or participants to take photos of their environment, to be able to visually see what was going on. And what I asked the students to do was take a picture anywhere around campus that you feel like your Hispanic Latina identity, you are comfortable or uncomfortable in, and kind of just let that sit, however the students took that. And so some students decided to take 2 photos of the places that they were really kind of uncomfortable being their true selves. And some students chose 2 comfortable spaces. There was overlap in some of the photos that they took, and it was really interesting to kind of see where they were kind of going. And ultimately, what this photo voice does is it allows the students to see the photos that were taken amongst the focus group, which was about 6 students, evenly split with gender. So it was pretty interesting. And they were able to discuss and see what their photos were and why they decided to take those photos. And what was interesting was that a lot of the students agreed, in most cases, that, oh yeah, I didn't even think about to take a picture of that space. Yes, I agree. When I go into that space, I don't feel comfortable, or I feel comfortable here, or I don't here. So that was kind of some anecdotal stuff that was interesting in that focus group. And that ultimately what Photo Voice wants to do is to inform policymakers. It kind of that research starts in medical research, to kind of like inform policymakers on the medical side and the healthcare field. But this is, in my view, going to influence policymakers at like the national level and even at institutional level to kind of take a more deeper, more visual look into what students are visually seeing in physical spaces on campus. Because when we think of servingness, we may not think about what this picture on the wall is doing to the Hispanic Latina identity on campuses. And so that's kind of initially, where I started with it. The initial findings, I think a lot of them are pretty, I guess, knowledgeable, that we kind of already are seeing some of these themes in other scholarship, HSI scholarship. But ultimately, that counter narratives are needed, that allowing the space for students to speak their mind and speak truth to power is absolutely needed in evaluating and contemplating what servingness means on HSI campuses. And noting that, every campus is going to be different. Every HSI campus designated is going to be different. So servingness is going to look somewhat nuanced on every single campus. And so on this campus, it was a predominantly white HSI that was an emerging HSI. And so when I say predominantly white, it means that, most of the student population is white. Even though they are approaching that designation requirement of at least 25% Hispanic Latina students, it doesn't negate the fact that they are historically a white institution and predominantly white currently. And so that doesn't erase the systematic pressures and systems that are affecting the Hispanic students. So that's why I ultimately chose that. And so allowing the students of the space to be able to say what they want on campus. Part of that was more Hispanic art. In the study, one of the findings was a picture of Frida Kahlo, and it was in the student center, but it was tucked away in a corner where not everybody can see it. But that was the only Hispanic art that was displayed on campus. And so the students were like, I just wish that we had more representations of our culture, especially Hispanic art. And this was another counter narrative type answer that was like, look, we can speak truth to power by allowing our artwork to speak for us in spaces that we weren't allowed in prior to certain movements, right? Ultimately, that kind of translated it into another finding, which was people transforming spaces. We don't recognize the power that we all have when we walk into a space. In the study, the example was Mr. Medina. Mr. Medina was a key figure, and this is a pseudonym, that was, all the students agreed that when he walked into the room, they ultimately felt more comfortable immediately in their Hispanic identity, because they knew that he was a resource. They knew that they could come into his office, which was one of the pictures that they submitted was his office, and talk about anything, talk about the news of the day, talk about things in Spanish that they're more comfortable speaking their own language. And that was powerful to recognize that even a white professor that acknowledged one of the students in the study, that she was a leader on campus and that she was doing a dual degree in Spanish and athletic training. This white professor gave her validation, and initially that classroom space was negative for her. It turned it into a positive experience. So now that space, she actually loves that space. So that along with some of the racialized experiences that these students experience was also something powerful. One of the biggest quotes that I get out of this study was, "I thought the library was for everyone." And that was from one of the students. And she outright said, "I go to the library, but I don't feel like I belong in the library." And all the students agreed. Every single one of the participants said, yes, I just go in and go back out, whenever I'm in the library. And if I do go in the library, I isolate in the stacks away from everybody. And I don't congregate with my friends because I'm afraid that if I speak Spanish, I'm going to be judged. I'm afraid that my loud voice as a Latino is going to be judged, in that space. So I just avoid it, or I just wait until the last minute to go. And that ultimately, you think about all the resources and different articles that are available, technology that is available to these students in these libraries, but these students are avoiding them completely. And what does that say to persistence rates, to sense of belonging, right? And so it has a lot of these implications that, we don't realize that not every space is neutral. Their spaces are just not inherently neutral to all students. So that was kind of the findings that one of the more prominent findings that I really like to highlight is that, there are spaces in which students feel like they can't sit down and rest in the middle of the day just because of their skin color, just because of the way they have an accent, or they're afraid of speaking Spanish over the phone while talking to mom and dad. These spaces are not inherently neutral. So those three are kind of like the main findings of my study.
Awesome. Oh my gosh, I have so many questions, but
sorry.
No,
I rambled there.
No, I love it. I loved all of it. I do want to first say that I do always appreciate the conversation on art and what the actual physical space feels like. I found the same thing in my dissertation, like several years before. Same exact thing. People talked about art on the walls as the thing that represented servingness to them. Right. And I'm like, the art on the wall, like, say more, right? What do you mean? And like the pictures, obviously they took the pictures for you, but it was the art that was like the art that had Latinx artists or Chicanx artists, right? That's where people felt, the most at home, or the most where it felt like an HSI. But as you say, the opposite can be the case. Whereas if the art is representing like a frontier native being shot or something, right? Like something violent.
Absolutely.
People feel that too, right? There's articles about that, about Native American, Indigenous, Latinxes feeling the exact opposite, right? That the art is actually violent, right? That it can be absolutely violent. So art is powerful. It can be really, really powerful, as can buildings, right? Buildings can be even just representations of colonial pasts, right? That students might be like, I don't know about this. But the library, that's fascinating. That was the one place that people were like, no. And like, I mean, it's like almost like the library is necessary at a college or university, right? Like we all go into the library at least once, at least back in the days. I don't know. Now most of the stuff you can get electronically. I know I do. I'm like, if it's not an ebook, I'm not reading it.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's not the case always. Sometimes you got to have those stacks, right?
Yes, exactly.
So that's such an important piece, because libraries aren't necessarily talking about their role in servingness.
Right.
Yet they are absolutely part of it.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Exactly. And that's just like exactly what you just said. The role of servingness is not inherently designated to a DEI division, right? A diversity, equity, inclusion division. It needs to be in every day, every classroom, every single space, mission. And that's what I think this study kind of highlights is not only is your physical office space sometimes being evaluated as a mode of servingness, but also the space that you bring in when you enter a space, the energy, the ability for students to feel more comfortable, that transforms spaces. So an inherently negative space may be completely changed just by you being in it, being present in these students' lives. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the people, that's a big thing too with like servingness is like, sometimes it's just the person.
Yeah.
It's not the actual institution. It's like a person represents serving, or I recently was talking to a colleague who called themselves a server, right? Or how do we be better servers, right? Like that the people are the servers, not the institution, right? The institution isn't serving, but the people are, and how powerful that is, right? That the people matter. We know that.
Exactly.
So were there any other spaces that were we should think about on college campuses that were not spaces of servingness that came out of your study? Because I could think of a lot, but any other ones that came out, empirical evidence?
Sure. In this particular study, there was a lot of the students all took pictures of the student center, different spaces within the student center, mainly this main congregating area. And I kind of already alluded to this earlier, but it was a situation in which there was this couched area where these students would come by to see Mr. Medina because his office was right there off of this couched area. And all the students said, every time I walk into there, there is nothing but just white students laying down and sleeping there, or utilizing the space every single time. And I can't go there, and it's a comfortable space to rest in between classes. And that conversation carried into another student's picture, which was a general area just off the couched area, where the student said the exact same thing. Like, I come to hang out in between classes, and I can't do that because all this space is just taken up. And I just don't. So they just avoid the space completely. And think about, again, all the resources available in student centers, why they would be able to, just to hang out in that space and then think, oh, you know what? I need to go pay my bill. So I'm going to go pay my bill, or I'm going to go grab something to eat really quick in between classes. But they can't because they don't have a place to sit. And so they may just avoid it completely. And then that affects sense of belonging overall on campus. If I'm only able to go to this one little corner of campus, whereas that's where I feel most comfortable, and that may be somebody's office, they may not be there all the time. So that was another space, was a student center, a place where you would think students would be, really belonging or feels much belonging. They didn't. That goes for academic classrooms too. There was a lot of classrooms that they talk about that they're just like, I didn't feel comfortable here. I didn't feel like I could speak Spanish. One of the examples the students utilized was a Spanish classroom that they felt comfortable in because they were able to just speak their language, their native language. But once they crossed that threshold, they didn't feel the same comfortableness to be able to say, like, speak their own native language. And so that speaks a lot to the power of intersectionality of language and the ability to feel comfortable in your identity, but not just that of communicating kind of in your identity. But that was pretty much the negative spaces that the students avoided. But one of the spaces that they all agreed upon was the soccer fields. That was really comfortable. As we both know, soccer is a very popular sport in our culture. And these particular students were like, we love to go just to go play soccer. But not only that, but we love to go to like the actual NCAA matches, because most of the students that are playing have Spanish last names. And I can relate to them, or their mom, their dads, their tias, they're in the stands yelling Spanish chants or Spanish, to their mija or mijo, cheering them on. And it just feels like a sense of home, where they can truly kind of relax, be around people who look like them and love the same sport. That was something that they all mentioned, was soccer was something that at that institution in particular, they could all rally behind and go to these games together and feel like they truly belonged.
Absolutely. I don't think I've ever heard that before, to say that was an embodiment of servingness. But I think it gets to the fact that servingness is super complicated. Like, people want a checklist almost. Like, just give us a checklist, right? And we'll check it off and we'll do the 10 things. And it's just not that easy. It's just not that simple. So yeah, I think that's a first. I don't think I've heard that one yet, but I hope we'll see, publications coming out from your dissertation soon, writing about those kind of things. But this is also a form of knowledge sharing, right? That's the point of this podcast, is that like, we shouldn't have to read research articles to get knowledge, right? This is as a form of knowledge sharing. So thank you for sharing, some of the findings from your dissertation.
Yeah, of course.
Do you think if you did the dissertation at your new institution that it would be different? Because it's not predominantly white, isn't it? Predominantly Hispanic, Latine at your new institution, right? You think it'd be differences?
Yeah, I think there would definitely be differences. However, I do think that there are still, or at least what I'm finding here, is that there are still institutions that are designated HSIs, but not necessarily act like they are HSIs. And that's okay. I think that it's important to say that, you may be designated an HSI at a certain period of time in your history, and that may have just been a very monetary decision to kind of get more funding for the institution. But it's important to recognize that when you do see that servingness may or may not be happening, that's the moment to start taking action, right? That's the moment where you can start doing the research, doing the work to actually course correct some of these things. So I think at my institution in particular, if I were to do the study here, there would be, maybe not as much, I would say like artwork type spaces, like we don't have very much Spanish artwork, but we do have a lot of representation. There's a lot of Hispanic Latina staff here. There is a lot of student organizations that are very active here. And there's just an overall commitment being in South Texas to the Hispanic Latina culture. And so they can go to any restaurant around town and see people who look like them. As opposed to maybe in a Lubbock or San Angelo, which are my two other institutions, which are predominantly white cities. And, so it may be more of a external influence, here where it's more generally accepted as a culture in the city, as opposed to the campus. I think a lot of what has happened here is that, because we are diverse in the way that we are 75% Hispanic, that servingness was just happening. Like it was just automatically inherent. It had to have been happening already, which is not true, right? Like the DEI work in general doesn't just happen. There is a lot of anti-Blackness and, homophobia that happens within the Hispanic Latina culture that needs to be called out. And just because we're diverse doesn't necessarily mean that we're equitable or inclusive. And so I think that's part of what we probably would see if we utilize the same study on my campus.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not putting any pressure on you, but it seems like a good comparative study. HSIs
Absolutely.
in Texas. I mean, you have been at 3 different HSIs in the same state that are arguably very, very different.
Yes.
Even just me not even experiencing them, you've experienced them. But that's the powerful thing about HSIs and servingness is it is very specific to the region, to the part of the state, to the actual state you're in.
Yes.
All of that matters, right? When it comes to servingness.
Absolutely.
I'm going to detour us really quickly because you have been using the term Latine with the E instead of the X. And maybe some of our listeners are not familiar with that term yet. Can you talk to us a little bit about why you chose to go with the E instead of the X?
Sure. Yeah. So this is actually something that I learned from other scholars. The reasoning behind choosing the difference. So for those that are listening, Latinx is a gender neutral, non-conforming term to describe the Latina population. And it was used because the Spanish language is very gendered. And so Latinx I used for a while, and in a lot of my writing too as well. It wasn't until recently, I actually went to the ASH conference in Puerto Rico. And it was amazing, first of all, great conference. But I learned from other scholars, the use and intentionality behind Latinx. This was a term that was created by the LGBTQIA community for the LGBTQIA community. And I feel like we just co-opted it and immediately started to use it as an umbrella term for everyone and everything that needs to be inclusive. And I use quotation marks because not everybody, people are utilizing Latinx in just like a generalized way to just seem savvy and inclusive when they may not know the history of the term. And so I try to utilize Latine because it's the same thing, utilizing a non-gendered term for Latino or Latine or Latina, but without co-opting a term that was specifically created by a particular population. So not owning and almost colonizing in a way a term that was created by this population for this population. And so that's the reason why I utilize Latine more. And it is also an easier way in the language to say, like when you're speaking Spanish, it kind of rolls off the tongue a little bit easier than saying Latinx in the Spanish language. So that's why I personally use Latine.
Thank you for sharing. Because I've grappled with whether or not I should move to the E, even in my new book that will come out in January.
Hey.
Yay.
Yay.
I thought about using it, and then I was like, I don't think my publisher's ready, right? Because now that's another level of educating, but we shouldn't have to keep educating folks. Like, we gonna use the terms we're gonna use, right? And the E is more conducive to the Spanish language than the X. Although I do like the term abuelex. That's one of my favorites. Some words are fun.
Absolutely.
But you know, and I also always just defer to, like, people have to use what they feel comfortable with, you know. So if that's what you feel comfortable with, and people are accepting it in your space, I'm glad, right? That you're pushing that narrative that, like, we have to think about what terms we're using and be inclusive without co-opting. What a powerful thing to think about, right? We're co-opting terms all the time.
Yes.
So thank you for that divergence from servingness to terms, because people always ask about terms. So it's like, it's important for us to have this conversation.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about practice, because you have, like I said, been at 3 different institutions in Texas with very different populations, emerging HSIs, predominantly white HSIs, pretty strong HSIs, into, like, we're almost all completely Latine HSI, right? So talk about the various ways you've seen servingness enacted, without it being empirical, without you having collected any data, but, like, even in your own experiences as a student, as a practitioner, now in your current role. What are some of the ways you're seeing servingness enacted?
Sure. So I'm going to go back to actually my undergrad experience. At Angelo State, one of the saving graces, there was 2 things that saved me from quitting college, honestly. And I categorize it in servingness for this reason. I was a part of first generation Rams, which our mascot is a ram. And basically what it is was it gave you a family of other first generation students, but there was also a host family program in which you were assigned to, or you were matched with somebody that was a faculty, staff, or administrator on campus that was your family while you were at Angelo State. And you got a host parent and you were the host child. And they were just a resource. There was somebody typically, and I got assigned to a Latino. Luckily, I was able to relate culturally with them. And so they were able to say, hey, don't go to this restaurant, go to this restaurant because it's better, you know, or hey, you know, I'm a staff member on this campus, go to this person for this resource. Hey, you know, have you thought about, you know, paying your bill? Are you on a payment plan? I saw the drop date is coming up. Are you doing okay? You know, how can I help you? That was a saving grace, because that gave me that family aspect that I was missing from my family. That they, you know, even though I'm very close to my family members and they would do anything, they were still 3.5 hours away. And so I needed somebody there and then, and I really didn't have very many friends that came from high school with me to college. And so that program really did help me. The second part is student organizations. And I cannot understate how important student organizations are in the role of servingness, especially Latine, Hispanic focused. Mine was the Association of Mexican American Students, AMAS for short. And in AMAS, I'll be honest, my Latine identity wasn't formed until I got to college. I was, you know, very kind of kept away from my culture growing up. For various different reasons, a lot of just to avoid outward racism in my community. Like the whole, you know, don't go outside too long, you're going to get too dark type thing, you know, they're going to make fun of you. I experienced that my whole life. And so when I got to college and I joined this organization, they truly taught me, you know, who I was and what my culture was. I had no idea who Cesar Chavez was until I was 18. You know, I had no idea. And this is something that, like, historical, right? And so I started learning more, Dolores Huerta, and, you know, we started celebrating those people, and I learned so much. And because of that, that's where I truly do mean that I give credit to not only my mentors and, like, the first gen Rams and all that program. AMAS is what saved me in keeping with my degrees, and of course my mentors along the way as well. But those 2 things are great examples of servingness that still continue today. When I went to Texas Tech University for my terminal degree, I joined their Hispanic organization, even though I was, you know, 28 years old and they're all, you know, 18, 19, 20. Like I joined and they welcomed me with open arms. And it was just a way to just relax and just be yourself and do fun things like intramurals, play sand volleyball, or go dancing at salsa night with everybody. And it was just fun. So those are kind of some examples. And I can't understate the importance of celebrating our culture. Texas Tech has an amazing Hispanic Heritage Month program that really exemplifies what all institutions, I believe, should be doing. They have a great El Grito that kind of kicks it all off. They celebrate HSI week. And this is all just kind of new type stuff that they're changing as they've gotten their HSI identity and their designation. They're really kind of taking that seriously. And the work that they're doing is important. They have an HSI committee. And so like all of these different things all add up to great servingness examples. And ultimately what I'm doing is I'm taking all of those great practices and even stuff that I've learned from my dissertation and my scholarship and applying them here as we start the work. Because like I said, I'm the inaugural director. So we're starting to figure out, do we want to pursue the Seal of Excellencia? How do we do that? Why are we doing that? What's the intention behind that? Are we honoring our Hispanic Latine organizations on campus? Are we giving them enough resources? Are they doing all of the legwork when it comes to programming? Or should we be owning that so they can relax and enjoy it and really kind of just be students? So yeah, that's kind of the holistic kind of my experience with servingness and some examples that institutions are doing. And Angelo State is a predominantly white, almost predominantly Hispanic now HSI. Texas Tech just became an HSI, I think in 2019. And then of course, here at A&M Kingsville, we've been an HSI since the designation was born. We had Hispanic students in our very first graduating class and attendees because it's just South Texas is just predominantly Hispanic. So very different cultural, historical differences, but we're all doing great things that kind of fall in that servingness category.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those things. And some of those things, I think about HSIs as like already doing the servingness without thinking it was servingness. Mm-hmm. And you said something so important that a lot of times that comes from students, mm-hmm. right? That students are the one, but then I love that you added, but are we supporting them? Are we giving them funding? Are we making sure they're well and mm-hmm. not putting retention and belongingness on students?
Yes.
Like you can't put that on students. They're trying to figure it out, right? And get good grades and deal with their own mental health and families away and whatever. But they're such powerful sources, right? Those student organizations.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, one of the things I can't remember what Netflix show it was, but it was so profound. It stuck with me to this day. But it said something to the fact of like resiliency is just saying that you are surviving. Like we talk about resiliency as this metric of, oh my gosh, we've gotten this amount of students to retain and persist. But ultimately what you're saying is these students are surviving. They're resilient enough to get a degree, to get to this end goal. But we need to really kind of frame it in that way of, not every student is going to just be able to persist on the same level with the same resources, et cetera. Each individual kind of needs to be served in their own way. And we got to start looking at it that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the intersectionality is an important piece of that, mm-hmm. right? Because how you're serving, different genders, different, mm-hmm. even first gen, the organization you talked about, right? That was for first gen students. That's an intersection, right? That some of our students are first gen, and that is an important piece, but not all of our students are, right? Maybe a good amount, but it can't be reduced to one thing. That servingness is super complicated. We have different races, different genders, different generations to college, all these different aspects have to come in. So yeah, thinking about students' individual needs still has to be a part of servingness.
Yeah.
So what are your plans? You've kind of sprinkled in a little bit of this, but what are your plans for enacting servingness in your new role as the inaugural director for diversity, equity, and inclusion at Texas A&M University Kingsville?
Sure. So I think the very first thing, we have a wonderful new president, Dr. Robert Vela. He just came from San Antonio College. And he's an alum, and he is actually very involved with the Seal of Excellencia, or Excellencia in Education. And so my very first thing is to lead the charge in getting the seal. But I want to be careful about being intentional about what we're doing, right? So like I'm always afraid of institutions pursuing the seal just to pursue the seal, right? And not kind of having those accountability measures in place so that when you get the seal, you're able to hold yourself accountable for those servingness metrics. So we're building that. And I'm really excited about it because we're building a committee that's going to have 3 different kind of prongs to it. One that focuses on academic engagement. What are we doing inside the classroom? One that focuses on research grants, external funding, kind of the typical model of what an HSI would be looking for. And then student engagement or student success. What are we doing to ensure that these students are succeeding in their lives, in their academic programs, but also on campus and retaining, to persist to a degree. So those 3-pronged approaches is how we're going to approach it as a committee structure, and then kind of take it up and lead the charge to the Seal of Excellencia. But also, like I mentioned earlier, is amplifying the student voices. Counter narratives are not just important in our research. It has to be in practice too. I'm not afraid. I'm not shy of having difficult conversations. I would rather a student sit in my office and tell me that we are doing a terrible job than them being silent, because I want to make sure that their experience is better than even mine whenever I was in college. I think that's ultimately why I joined higher education, was to give students a better experience, so that they do retain and they're able to help further our comunidad, and so anyway, that's kind of what the original plan is just kind of to implement a structure that has accountability, but also where every single facet of this campus is getting involved and has a responsibility in our servingness structure. I think that it's not just, like I said earlier, it's not just a DEI division type thing. It has to come from every single aspect of campus. And so I'm trying to kind of implement each one of those things, bolster our cultural enhancing experiences. That's going to be big, because we have some things that are in the works before, but really kind of diving deeper into, what does it mean to be a Latino that has mental health issues or mental health needs. I am very open about my mental health and going to counseling. And I think it's important that we implement some of those things into our education for Hispanic Heritage Month and beyond the month. But again, it goes into those intersectionality things. What are we doing when we talk about Pride Month? Are we honoring just in general Pride Month and without acknowledging the intersectionality of the different identities that we have on campus? What does it mean to be Black and queer? Why are we not evaluating that experience and bolstering those voices? So really kind of making sure that the student is involved at every single level is one of the main missions of what I'm trying to do here at A&M Kingsville.
I love it. I'm so glad to hear that, because I say a lot often that HSI is administrator driven often. Yeah. Right. That it's coming from the upper levels and sort of coming down on us, and we should do HSI. And it's so powerful that I've come in contact with institutions that are like, when we get a new president and they don't want to do HSI, everything stops, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's that high level. So to think about it coming from students, maybe even student advisory boards, right? Like none of that has really been explored yet. I always tell people, do photo voice or PAR. I've done PAR projects with students, right? The participatory action research projects. Yeah. And just like you, I found they will tell you exactly what it is.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't hold back. Yeah. They're like, well, it's nowhere on the website. Why is it on the website? Mm-hmm. And it's like, it took a student to tell you that you didn't have HSI anywhere on your website. But they will. They're like, we don't have a social media account. We don't have a website, right? Like they'll tell you all those things. Admissions and records. I heard this. Admissions and records is terrible. Fix them, right? They'll tell you exactly what it is. And it's like, we don't ask the students, right? We just start doing all the let's read Dr. Garcia's book and let's get the Excellencia seal. I want you to read my books, yes, but it's not everything, right? Like the students will tell you they didn't need to read the books to tell you what they need and what they want,
Right.
right? Like
Exactly.
they're going to just tell you because it's their everyday experience.
Right.
So yeah, so of course, read the book, get the Excelencia seal. All of those things are important, but it's just getting students engaged, I think is a great way to go about it. So I'm glad to hear that you're thinking along the way, and it aligns obviously with your research and really your way of being, a higher ed practitioner.
Yeah, absolutely. And just again, like servingness is nuanced, it's going to look different at state level, region, although we are in South Texas, we're in that little sliver that is very conservative, right? So it's like, how does that play into the politics of being an HSI and really truly honoring the designation of what the original intent was behind serving and honoring the Hispanic student? And so, again, it's going to look different. Each and every campus is going to look different. But that's where you go to the students and you say, what are your needs? How can we help you? What is preventing you from especially when you look at the data, right? I hope you have really good data at your institution. When you look at it, what is preventing a Hispanic Latine, member of the LGBTQIA community that is a first-gen student from graduating from year 3 to 4, or from, persisting from 3 to 4, graduating between 4 and 6 years. Looking at that data and being able to say, okay, they are the reason why, the qualitative reason why they're telling us is because, financial aid is really hindering us, or we don't have enough grants, or I don't have access to a food pantry, not even talking about food insecurity, right? I can't go to the library. I don't have Wi-Fi at home because I don't feel comfortable speaking Spanish in the library. All those things all intersect and really can be barriers to these students. And we need to further understand the individual more than the holistic.
Absolutely. It's funny you say a little sliver of conservative. I haven't jabbed at Texas yet, but I thought all of Texas was conservative. No, just kidding. The politics, right? I think as we watch as a country, we're like politically Texas. Everybody I meet in Texas, well, of course, I interact with a lot of higher ed folks, are right on board with me. They're like, yeah, we know.
Yeah, exactly.
We know. But I'm going to ask you a question about that, about like operating, right, in a state like Texas, where the policies are kind of operating against servingness. But first, I wanted to ask you about any thoughts on, I know you're still new to the position, but what kind of anticipated challenges do you see just in general with doing DEI work? You said it's brand new at this institution, right? Your new institution is like now just going in that path. What are some of the sort of anticipated challenges of doing this work at a predominantly Hispanic Latine HSI?
Sure. I think the initial challenge that I'm having is kind of what I said earlier of everybody just expected that this work was happening. But nobody knew whose job it was. And so now that there's a designated position, one of the challenges I'm finding is really just defining what this means. What does DEI and then ultimately belonging, what does all that mean? And why are we doing it? Or why haven't we been doing it? Or I think I've been doing it, but I don't know. Like, can you explain this to me? And so that's kind of the questions that I'm having to answer. Being in, and this kind of can go into the next geopolitical, part of it, in a conservative type area, when you talk about servingness, a lot, especially HSIs, a lot of the initial response is, well, shouldn't we be serving everyone? Why are we just talking about Hispanic students? Already kind of seeing that narrative, not just at this institution, other institutions as well that I've been at, the initial knee-jerk response that I've seen from administrators is, oh, we're an HSI, but this benefits all students. And I think that hinders, I think that kind of hinders the message of like what the intent of serving this bigger population as it's growing on your campus, that shouldn't be a but, it can be an and, but not a but. And that, I think that messaging piece is huge. So we need to kind of get away from that. But that is one of the challenges that I'm seeing is we need to message the HSI thing better, but not just message it, also actually own the identity and really kind of know what it truly means on our campus. And so a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing is having separate town halls for staff, faculty, administrators, and students. And we're all going to ask the same question. What does it mean to be served here on this campus for the Latine students on our campus? Even the Hispanic faculty members, the Hispanic staff members, what does all that mean? And how can we help, mitigate some of those hurdles or those challenges that you're having? That's kind of some of the challenges that I'm running into. Even at other institutions, whenever I was there, the pushback is really just, well, we need to be looking at all students. It's very equivalent to the all lives matter type messaging, which is very unfortunate. But it's the reality of some of these institutions that are having to deal with this. So that kind of wraps it up, is that it really is just, learning what being an HSI means, messaging that correctly, and kind of owning that identity.
Absolutely. The all lives matter approach is not going to work. I say that all the time. Like, we have to really think through, and at a place where you're predominantly Hispanic Latine, then it really is starting to get into the intersections, right? Like, yes. Which of our students need even more support? Yeah, if they have mental health needs, like how are we how is that becoming a part of Servingness, right? How are our gender, students of different gender, across the binary, how are we serving them? Women in a state where women's rights are being attacked, right? Like, how are we making sure we are serving them, right? Like, all of those conversations have to happen, because the all lives matter, like it's going to trickle down. It's not, right? Yeah. Those groups are going to be harmed. We know it. So I'm glad they got you driving the bus or whatever, whatever analogy it is.
Yeah.
Driving the bus on this, because you definitely have that perspective of like, yeah, no, this is going to take work. I imagine if I asked you in a year what the challenges were, you're going to tell me a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah.
It's probably going to be challenging, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean we don't do it. Go ahead.
I just inherently with fighting against a system that has existed for decades and centuries, it's going to be hard. There is going to be a traditional pushback because we're going to be wanting to do things differently and really targeting specific groups on campus to help them get a degree, which just sometimes boggles my mind that that's even a controversial thing. But I think, again, I think part of it too, it goes back to my first point of education. I am an educator. I need to, and a lot of others on campus that understand this concept need to do better at educating those around us that may not understand. But if you just sit down and have an honest conversation with them, they may have a better understanding of, why this is so important. As we see the climb of the Hispanic Latina population on this country, there's going to be a socioeconomic need for these students to get a degree. And so we need to be sure that they're persisting. Ultimately, that comes back on me and us as educators to help these other faculty staff members to really kind of get that buy-in of servingness.
Absolutely. So let's get into the geopolitical, historical sort of thoughts on doing servingness in Texas. One of the things I talk about in the new book that is coming out, I talk about external influences on servingness. And I talk about it, but I kind of just theorize because we haven't written extensively about this. But I think a lot of us know it, right? Like, just because it hasn't been written down doesn't mean people haven't experienced it right in their different places. So talk to me a little bit about that, about, servingness, what kind of local sort of policies and or historical sort of things that might affect servingness or that you've seen local, regional, and then state level, right? Like how can those sort of different concentric circles help or hinder servingness? Sure.
I think to start out, I'm going to start at my current institution and kind of work my way back out. I think locally here, because there is such a heavy Hispanic cultural exception, like they love the culture and they really truly accept it here. There's a support system that is there to kind of catch us as we do this work. It carries into the community. We have a great financial and just in general support system from the King Ranch, which that's kind of how Kingsville kind of got its name. King Ranch is one of the biggest ranches in Texas. We butt up right against it. And so there are some influences there as well. And, I think there are ways that this is going to help us continue the charge. Now, when you talk about, Lubbock and where Texas Tech is, that is a very ruby red conservative area. And I know a lot of my colleagues that work at that institution get a lot of pushback on any sort of DEI type work. They're still doing it and they're doing an amazing job at it, but they're getting a lot of pushback. So when they talk about servingness, they do get a lot of those questions about, well, why aren't we having, servingness for white students or black students, and it's always like we can do both things at the same time. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. This is just an all-out effort, a designation to say that we're going to be intentionally looking at this population to help them out. When you kind of zoom back out to the surrounding support system of like counties, the institutions that surround each other really do partner well. We're only 30 minutes from Corpus Christi, which is Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. They're a great partner in a lot of the work that we do. Even Texas A&M University International, which is in Laredo, and all of South Texas. We really are a good coalition. And even in Texas, we have the Texas HSI consortium, and where we work together as HSIs to kind of figure things out. That is, again, a good bare bones scaffolding support for doing the servingness work. Again, zoom out even more when you go to the Texas in the state. This is where you start getting into the politics of things, and where you see a lot of the anti-racism movement of, they're against CRT, they're against DEI work, and they've equated the two. When you have those issues, that emboldens people around you that do believe in those conservative values. That's okay to say that, you can be a conservative and still do great servingness work. It's just that when it's fed in a political way that DEI work is a negative thing and works against a certain population, that's what makes this work a lot harder. So having to do the education of DEI doesn't necessarily equal CRT, but let me tell you a little bit more about what critical race theory is and why I believe you have a misconception of what it is. And so again, it's a lot of that educating. I've had to do a lot of that work in my family to kind of talk about that. And ever since then, they've kind of understood, okay, now I get it, and now I understand why you're doing the work that you're doing. I even had family members really concerned about me taking this job because of the current geopolitical things that are going on in the country as a whole, because there is a lot of people who just do not think that this work is needed and that it's, quote, anti-American. And so when you couple that, the anti-CRT movement, and even though I utilized critical race theory and Latino critical race theory to evaluate in my dissertation, and I kind of have that lens in general in life, you couple that with a state that really doesn't fund higher education institutions well. Unless you are a flagship institution and you have kind of the oil money behind you, we call it the PUF, the Permanent University Fund. If you don't have that behind you, institutions are struggling to get resources and to get funding. And, as higher ed is not being funded, a lot of these institutions are seeking out designations and grants like the HSI grants. And whether they do it, to actually, serve students, or actually the work with Stephanie Aguilar-Smith, she does great at looking at Title V funding and knowing kind of, what these institutions and why they're pursuing this designation to offset those budget shortfalls, right? And that kind of speaks to, what are our intentions behind pursuing the designation. So again, those two things together make it really difficult to do this work sometimes. Again, every institution is different. they're all influenced kind of differently by their board of regents, by their presidents, by their alumni in the state legislatures. That's a big thing here. If you are not kind of in the A&M, which we're in the A&M system, or in the UT system, if you don't have like that kind of buy-in from those alumni that are in the state legislatures, that could affect your funding, or it could make it a little bit harder to open up or do a resource center or whatever your institution is trying to do. So all of those things combined really do, affect the way that we serve. And ultimately too, it could be just a messaging thing. Some institutions, we have a study coming out, me and my colleague, Dr. John McNaughton, that kind of evaluates the way that HSI community college leaders are communicating. And one of the things that this president said is kind of a little taste of what's coming, is that, I don't go into the state legislature in my state and I say, we are a Hispanic serving institution. We need funding for Hispanic students. He's like, I can't message that. And so what I say instead is, I need money for first generation students. And inherently, that includes minoritized populations. And so I can get the funding that I need without having to say that we're an HSI, and that we're getting funding, that we need funding specifically for Hispanic students. But it's crazy that they have to do that. They have to make that paradigm messaging type shift in order to get what they need for their students. So yeah, that ultimately kind of gives you a little bit of a background of what it's like in Texas, and then ultimately actually in other states as well.
That was a very complex and answer that I needed. I'm like, because I asked it a lot, right? I'm like, how this is complicated, right? And like I said, there's not a lot of research. But yeah, I mean, you're getting into all these layers, right? And alumni, right? We haven't talked enough about the fact that alumni could shut Servingness down immediately. And then they're the local, leaders, and they're the state legislature, and all these like layers of complication that can ultimately affect Servingness.
Absolutely.
So it's so much more than just the enrollment. So yeah, that was a lot for me to think about. I'm going to think about it for a little bit longer. Like,
publication.
I know, right? I have all kind of publication ideas. We're going to have to talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Offline.
Yeah.
But to go with that, you're definitely a scholar practitioner, right? Like that you're drawing from scholarship to inform your practice. Who are the HSI scholars? You've mentioned Stephanie Aguilar Smith. Who are the HSI scholars? And maybe they're not HSI scholars, just scholars in general that you're accessing to do this work.
Sure. Well, one, Stephanie Aguilar Smith, we became friends over ASH, and, I really kind of delved into her work. But, as I was, researching as a young research assistant going into my dissertation or going into my doctoral work, your work came up. Anne-Marie Nunez, who I met actually at the HSI consortium, Texas HSI consortium this past month. Her work I kind of leaned on, Kristen Venegas, Francisco Contreras. I'm just trying to think of like my literature review right now of all the different things.
Alphabetically
right,
going down the list.
Yeah, exactly. But that kind of, Maricela Cuellar, Vanessa Sanson, all these scholars really kind of have driven my type of work and what I wanted to study. So I really kind of lean on them. I always look for those names, as publications are coming out to stay informed. And that's also another piece of this, right? Is that I think practice and scholarship sometimes don't talk to each other, or they really don't talk to each other, depending on, what institution you're at. But that's what I really try to aim to do, is to really do the scholarship that translates well with practitioners. Because otherwise, why are we doing what we're doing?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you just named all like my scholar crew. That's like my crew. Anne-Marie, Vanessa, Marcella, Stephanie, all also shout out to the Latinas doing this work. Like we gotta name that,
Absolutely.
Not that there aren't other people doing this work, but there's some good scholarship coming out, and just great scholars doing great work that I asked that question because I want listeners to, to be informed by like, oh, who are the people talking about these things I'm talking about, right? You mentioned
Yes.
Krista Venegas. I imagine you looked into her work for like financial aid stuff,
Yes.
right? Like she's done some great work around that. So, who are the scholars that we lean into to do this work? Because we got to learn from somewhere.
Yeah.
Because there's only our own ideas can only go so far. They can go pretty far. Our students,
Exactly.
they can teach us, but there's also a lot of us that are really trying to figure this out too,
Yeah.
and writing about it regularly. So thank you for sharing those. All my heroes, also sheroes.
Absolutely.
So the final question, and this one seems to stump everyone. I don't know why. It's just a hard question. Like people show up because they want to know, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? Like what's up? What's happening, right? So how would you answer that if someone says, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
I was thinking about this earlier, and it is kind of stumping to me. But what I really think is, if somebody were to ask me that, like, what's going on with what HSIs are doing, what's going on with this research, this scholarship, and this practice, and I think the best way that I can describe it is that it's evolving. It's an evolving area that still needs a lot of work in helping us define, what this truly means. And like we said earlier, it's complicated. But what we're doing, and as I know the HSI number did drip a little bit as far as designation goes, but we're still growing. Like there's still over 300 emerging HSIs in the queue that are going to jump into this space very soon, which not even getting into the funding side of things that is going to make it more competitive. We need to be looking for that answer to help these institutions. And so I think really what's up with this, I really think it's an evolving issue that we are really working hard to solve, so that these institutions can do the best that they can do, however they can, whether you're a community college, 4-year, private, in Texas, in Arizona, wherever. You have somewhat of a playbook to try to apply to your institution. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that question. I don't know if that's exactly what you're looking for, but yeah.
Absolutely. There's no answer to that, right? There's so much going on, which is why the podcast is coming on board, and other things I'm thinking about of like how do we keep learning and growing. We have so much learning and growing to do with HSIs. So with that, thank you for being a guest on ¿Qué pasa, HSIs, and for sharing all your knowledge with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you so much. I really appreciated this talk. It actually is very inspiring to get to talk about it and talk about the research that's being done. And so to all the listeners that are listening and all the scholars that are wanting to get into this space, I highly recommend it. You're joining greatness. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to join you.
Awesome. Thank you.